April 1915. Ypres, Belgium. A young Ojibwe hunter from Ontario crawls across the empty terrain as German machine guns sweep the darkness. He had never been to Europe before. He had never seen a trench. He had never fired a military rifle in combat. But he had spent his entire childhood hunting deer in the Georgian Bay forests, learning patience from his elders, understanding that the best hunters move like spirits. When this war ended, it would be confirmed that 378 people had been killed, more than all the snipers on both sides of the conflict combined. The Germans would never learn his name. They would only know that their soldiers were disappearing one by one. This is the story of the deadliest and most dangerous sniper in the history of World War I. Welcome! Today we're telling you about a Canadian hero whose name should be as famous as any general, any pilot, any Victoria Cross recipient. But isn't. Francis Pegahmagabow was the most effective sniper in the First World War, the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history, and after the war, a tireless advocate for his people's rights. If these stories of forgotten Canadian heroes matter to you, please subscribe. We're bringing these warriors back into the light where they belong. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Francis Pegahmagabow was born on March 9, 1891, at what is now Shawanaga First Nation on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay, Ontario. He was Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, a member of the Caribou clan. His father, Michael Pegahmagabow, died when Francis was just a baby. His mother, Mary, fell ill and couldn't care for him, so Francis was raised by his relatives, including Elder Noah Nebamaniquad, the same man who had raised Francis's orphan father. Young Francis grew up steeped in traditional Anishinaabe culture. Nebamaniquad taught him to fish and hunt in the old ways. His foster mother educated him about traditional medicine. He learned both Anishinaabe spirituality and Roman Catholicism. Most importantly, for what was to come, he learned patience, the kind of supernatural patience required to wait motionless for hours, watching, breathing with the forest, becoming invisible. He left school at age 12 and went to work, lumber camps, fishing stations, eventually as a marine fireman on the Great Lakes steamships for the Department of Marine and Fisheries. It was hard, honest work. Francis was 23 years old, working the boats when news arrived that would change everything. August 4th, 1914. Britain declared war on Germany. Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war. The call went out for volunteers. Here's the thing you need to understand. Indigenous peoples in Canada in 1914 were not considered full citizens. They couldn't vote. They lived under the oppressive Indian Act. Many weren't even allowed to leave their reserves without permission from a government agent. But Francis Pegahmagabow enlisted anyway. On August 13th, 1914, just 9 days after war was declared, he volunteered for the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He was assigned to the 23rd Regiment, Northern Pioneers, then transferred to the 1st Battalion, 1st Canadian Infantry Division. He was part of the 1st Contingent, the first 20,000 Canadian soldiers sent to fight in Europe. In February 1915, Francis Pegahmagabow arrived in France. He was assigned two of the deadliest jobs in the entire war, scout and sniper. Scouts had to venture into no man's land, that hellish strip of torn earth between the opposing trenches, to gather intelligence. Snipers had to eliminate enemy soldiers from extreme distances, often while exposed to enemy fire themselves. His fellow soldiers nicknamed him Peggy. They soon discovered that this quiet Ojibwe man from Ontario possessed skills that seemed almost supernatural. Francis was issued a Ross rifle, a Canadian-made weapon that had become notorious among infantry soldiers. The Ross jammed constantly in the mud and filth of trench warfare. It was hated by most Canadian troops, who threw them away and grabbed British Lee Enfields whenever possible. But as a sniper rifle, the Ross was extraordinary. Its long barrel and superior accuracy made it perfect for precision shooting, and Francis Pegahmagabow was about to prove just how deadly it could be in the right hands. He carried something else into battle too, an Ojibwe medicine pouch given to him by his elder. The bag was of skin, tightly bound with a leather thong, he later recalled. I wore it in the trenches. Francis believed the old medicine would protect him. Given what happened next, maybe it did. April 22nd, 1915, the Second Battle of Ypres. The Germans unleashed a new weapon that day, chlorine gas. It rolled across no man's land in a greenish-yellow cloud, heavier than air, sinking into the trenches where Allied soldiers choked and died by the thousands. Francis Pegahmagabow was there. He survived, but the gas exposure permanently damaged his lungs, an injury that would trouble him for the rest of his life. But during that chaotic, horrifying battle, something else happened. Francis began building his legend. While other soldiers panicked or died, Francis did what he'd been trained to do since childhood. He observed, he waited, and he struck. At night, he would crawl into no man's land, that death trap between the trenches where nothing lived, where machine guns swept constantly, where artillery shells exploded without warning. He would find a shell crater, settle in, become motionless, and then he would wait. Hours, sometimes all night. His iron nerves never failed. His patience, learned from years of hunting deer, was absolute. When a German soldier finally appeared, Francis would fire once. The Ross rifle barely kicked. The German would fall, and Francis would disappear back into the darkness before anyone even knew where the shot came from. In May 1916, Francis was awarded the military medal for his actions at Ypres, Festubert, and Givenchy. The citation noted his courage above fire in getting important messages through to the rear. He was being recognized not just as a sniper, but as a scout who repeatedly braved enemy fire to carry vital intelligence between Canadian units. But his war was far from over. September 1916, during fighting in France, Francis was shot in the leg. He recovered and returned to the line. By now, he'd been promoted to corporal, and his reputation as the most effective sniper in the Canadian forces was firmly established. The numbers tell part of the story: 378 confirmed kills. To put that in perspective, the average German sniper, and Germany had the best snipers in the world at the start of the war, would rack up about 40 kills before being located and eliminated by artillery. Francis Pegahmagabow killed 378 enemy soldiers. He also captured more than 300 German prisoners during his scout missions. But numbers don't tell you what it was like, night after night, crawling through mud and blood and body parts. The constant fear, the cold, the rats, the shells, the gas, the screaming. And through it all, Francis Pegahmagabow moved like a ghost, taking German lives with surgical precision. November 6, 1917. Passchendaele. If hell has a location on Earth, it was Passchendaele in late 1917. The battlefield wasn't even ground anymore. It was a swamp of mud, water-filled shell craters, and the dead. Roughly 20,000 Allied soldiers crawled forward, trying to take a village that had already been bombed into non-existence. The Canadian Corps attacked alongside 2 British divisions. They were told to take Passchendaele and hold it for 5 days until reinforcements arrived. The Allies would suffer 16,000 casualties in that attack. It was, by any measure, one of the most horrific battles of the entire war. Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow was in the middle of it. His role during the battle was crucial. As a scout, he maintained contact between units, especially on the 1st Battalion's flanks. When the battalion's reinforcements became lost in the chaos and in that nightmare landscape, it was easy to lose entire companies. Francis personally guided them to their positions. His citation for his first bar to the military medal reads, "At Passchendaele, November. 6/7, 1917, this NCO did excellent work. Before and after the attack, he kept in touch with the flanks, advising the units he had seen. This information proved the success of the attack and saved valuable time in consolidating. He also guided the relief to its proper place after it had become mixed up. In the hell of Passchendaele, where soldiers drowned in mud and the wounded disappeared into shell craters filled with water, Francis Pegahmagabow kept the Canadian attack from dissolving into complete chaos. He was one of only 39 Canadians to receive a bar to the military medal, meaning he'd performed a second act of extraordinary valor. But he wasn't done. August 30th, 1918. The Battle of the Scarpe, part of the 100 Days offensive that would finally end the war. Corporal Pegahmagabow's company found themselves in desperate trouble at Oryx Trench near Upton Wood. They were running out of ammunition. German counterattacks were intensifying. If they ran dry, they'd be overrun and slaughtered. Francis didn't hesitate. Under heavy machine gun and rifle fire, he left the relative safety of the trench and went into no man's land to retrieve ammunition. Think about that. The bullets are flying, every German gun in range is aimed at anything that moves, and Francis Pegahmagabow climbs out of the trench and walks into that death zone. He brought back enough ammunition to allow his company to hold their position and repel the German counterattacks. For this action, he received a second bar to his military medal. Memory Nobrefim making him one of only 39 Canadians in the entire war to receive the military medal with 2 bars. He was the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian military history. By November 11th, 1918, when the armistice finally silenced the guns, Francis Pegahmagabow had served for nearly the entire war. He fought at every major Canadian engagement: Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele, Amiens, the Scarpe. He was wounded, he was gassed, he watched his friends die, and he kept fighting. His son Duncan would later recall what his mother Eva told him. He used to go behind enemy lines, rub shoulders with the enemy forces, and never get caught. Francis himself rarely spoke about his accomplishments. When he did, he spoke about duty, about his country, about protecting his fellow soldiers. In April 1919, Francis was invalided back to Canada. In a ceremony at Buckingham Palace grounds, he was one of almost 200 veterans decorated by the visiting Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII. Francis Pegahmagabow came home a hero, but he was coming home to a country that still didn't consider him a full citizen. After the war, Francis joined the Algonquin Regiment in the non-permanent active militia, serving as a company sergeant major from 1930 to 1936. He married Eva, and they had 6 children. He worked various jobs to support his family, and he began another battle, one that would last the rest of his life. Despite his service, despite his medals, despite the fact that he'd killed more enemy soldiers than perhaps any other Allied sniper in the war, Francis Pegahmagabow returned to find himself still classified as a ward of the state under the Indian Act. He couldn't vote. His people were confined to reserves. Indian agents controlled nearly every aspect of Indigenous life. Veterans' benefits that white soldiers received were often denied to Indigenous veterans. It was a bitter irony. Francis had been good enough to fight and die for Canada, but not good enough to be treated as an equal citizen in the country he'd defended. Francis didn't accept it. Following in the steps of his father and grandfather, he became chief of the Wasauksing First Nation, then called Perry Island Band, and later a counselor. He corresponded with and met other noted Indigenous leaders, including Fred Loft, Jules Suey, Andrew Paul, and John Tatusis. He became an activist, fighting for Indigenous rights, for treaty obligations to be honored, for his people to be treated with the dignity they deserved. His war injuries caught up with him as he aged. The chlorine gas exposure at Ypres had so weakened his lungs that he had to sleep sitting upright to keep them from filling with fluid. On August 5, 1952, Francis Pegahmagabow died of a heart attack at St. Joseph's Hospital in Parry Sound, Ontario. He was 61 years old. He's buried in a military grave in Parry Sound. His grave is regularly visited by his descendants, including his 81-year-old daughter-in-law Priscilla and her daughter Teresa. They wish they'd known him better. Teresa was born just after Francis died, but they're proud of him. As a soldier, as a leader, as a man who never stopped fighting for what was right. In 2003, the Pegahmagabow family donated Francis's medals and chief headdress to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, where they're now part of the permanent First World War display. In 2019, he was designated a National Historic Person of Canada, recognition that came 67 years after his death. There's a bronze statue of Francis in Parry Sound. The 3rd Canadian Ranger Patrol Group headquarters building at CFB Borden is named after him. He's a member of Canada's Indian Hall of Fame. Canadian journalist Adrian Hayes wrote 2 biographies about him. Canadian novelist Joseph Boyden's 2005 novel 3-Day Road was partly inspired by his story. But ask most Canadians, even most military history enthusiasts, and they won't know his name. Why? Perhaps because Indigenous contributions to Canada's military history have been systematically overlooked. Perhaps because Francis himself rarely spoke about his service. Or perhaps because we simply failed to honor our heroes properly. Francis Pegahmagabow represents something profound. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, deeply connected to his Anishinaabe culture and spirituality, yet fighting in the most technologically advanced and brutal war in human history. He carried his medicine pouch into battle alongside his Ross rifle. He moved through the trenches with skills learned hunting deer in Georgian Bay. He was both traditional and modern, both warrior and peacemaker. After the war, when he could have retreated into bitterness over how he was treated, he chose to fight a different battle, for his people's rights, for justice, for recognition. He understood that courage isn't just about facing enemy bullets. Sometimes it's about facing your own government and demanding what's right. 378 confirmed kills, more than 300 prisoners captured, 3 military medals, 4 years on the Western Front, and a lifetime of service to his people. The German soldiers who died never knew his name. They just knew that the Canadians had someone out there. Someone who moved like a ghost, who shot with impossible accuracy, who seemed untouchable. They called the Canadians feared fighters, and men like Francis Pegahmagabow were the reason why. I'm asking you to share this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with young people who should know that Indigenous Canadians have always been warriors, always been heroes. Share it because Francis Pegahmagabow deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest military snipers in history. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. We're not letting these heroes be forgotten anymore. Francis Pegahmagabow, the ghost of no man's land, the deadliest sniper of World War I. A leader, an activist, a father, a Canadian hero, lest we forget.